It's time for the 22nd film in my 31 Horrors of Mike, a movie review each day of October leading up to Halloween, and of course they're mostly horror themed. So today's film is one which had quite a large impact on me as a child. It's one that I think helped forge my love of the anthology genre. It's also one which I thoroughly enjoyed as a kid, and it just always seems to stick in my mind. But it's also a film that was plagued by a terrible tragedy that happened during production, which has put many people off one of the directors, and has also put many people off even watching the film. The film wasn't actually a huge critical success at the time. It was actually quite lambasted as being very uneven, and perhaps it is uneven in places, but I still think it's definitely worth giving a second look. So the movie we're talking about is Twilight Zone, the movie. It's an adaptation of some of the stories from Rod Serling's classic science fiction series, The Twilight Zone, from the 1960s. And the idea was to take some of the most prominent directors of the time and have each of them direct a different segment of the film. The two of the directors were very, very well known at the time. You have Steven Spielberg, who was kind of behind the whole project, and he was the biggest name, obviously, coming off the back of films like E.T. and Jaws. And you had John Landis, who was coming back off of films like Animal House and Blues Brothers. So both of them were very well known at this time. But we also have Joe Dante, who I think is a fabulous director. I think he's definitely up there with the likes of Spielberg in terms of some of the films he produced in the 1980s. Films obviously did Gremlins. He did Gremlins, the new batch as well, which was a little bit later, but also did things like Explorers and Inner Space, two of my personal favourites from the 1980s. And he also did The Burbs as well, which is definitely one of my favourite films. And then we have George Miller, who directed the Mad Max series. Again, another fabulous director, especially Mad Max 2, The Road Warrior, is one of the best action films ever made. So, apart from one of the stories that are used, the other three stories that are in the film are based directly off of episodes of the old Twilight Zone film. We have a sort of loose wraparound. Most anthology films have some sort of wraparound where there's a story which threads all the films together. We don't really have anything that necessarily threads them all together, but we do have something which bookends the film. Now, my personal feeling on the movie, and I'm going to get to the controversy in a little bit, but my personal feeling on the film is that it's extremely underrated. I watched it again recently, and I was very impressed with the tone of it, with the standard of direction in the film from all four filmmakers. Certainly, there, as with all anthology films, there are some parts of the movie, there are some stories in the film which are better or higher quality than others. However, it is one of those rare anthology movies where I actually enjoy all the stories here. The film opens up with Albert Brooks and Dan Aykroyd's characters going along a lonely road out in some remote location in America in the dark, in the middle of the night. And Albert Brooks has picked Dan Aykroyd up. Dan Aykroyd's a hitchhiker, and the two of them start talking about old TV series. They start talking about Twilight Zone. They start playing a few games to try and freak each other out. Now, this segment, the prologue of the whole film, see this segment? See if you don't like the rest of the film, that's okay, because the opening segment to me is worth the price of admission. It really is. It feels like a campfire story. It feels like something that you would tell your friends when you're out in a remote location around a fire. It feels like a ghost story that you would be told as a kid, or it definitely has that feeling of it, and it also has an American vibe to it, and I really love the American campfire urban legend type of story, and that's one of the reasons why I love this opening to the film. It's the part which stayed with me the whole time, and it's perhaps the only part in the film which I think is genuinely really frightening. At least I find it. Maybe it's aged badly, certainly it's something which gave me nightmares as a child, especially since some of the actors that were involved. Like Dan Aykroyd, for example, was one of my favourite actors when I was growing up because I just loved Ghostbusters. And to see him in this very different role kind of, I think, unnerved me. But it's just such a great atmospheric opening to the film. However, here's the criticism of it. If you're a fan of the Twilight Zone series and you haven't watched Twilight Zone the movie, the opening is a prime example of what is both right with the film and what is wrong. It's well made, it's well crafted, it's enjoyable, and that's what really matters. However, the opening especially would actually have sat better in the Twilight Zone's follow-up series, which was called Night Gallery, which was an anthology TV series set up by Rod Serling, but it was horror-based. Twilight Zone was more fantasy and science fiction based, and I'm not saying Twilight Zone was never frightening, it was in places, but I'm not sure they got the spirit of the original TV series right in this film, and I think that may be one of the reasons why it was received quite poorly by critics and fans. But anyway, once we get off of the I should say, the banter between Albert Brooks and Dan Aykroyd at the start of this film is wonderful in that whole section. It's just brilliant, and I actually think that opening has had a real effect on me as someone who writes short horror stories. I think I wrote a short story recently. Actually, do you know what? I'll link to it down below so you can read it. Called Off the Beaten Path, which I think in some bizarre way may be influenced by stuff like this. The idea of being out in remote locations and what is out there in the dark, when you're isolated away from civilization. Anyway, so that's the first story. The opening, the prologue. It's only about 10 minutes long, but I think it's absolutely fantastic. I'd love to hear what your thoughts on it are. The first full story is where I don't know what I'm doing. My hands are went. Don't know what I'm doing. The first story is where the controversy and the scandal of the Twilight Zone the movie comes from, and the reason is that during the production of the first story, which is the only one which is not based off of any episode in the Twilight Zone series, there was a terrible accident, and the lead actor Vic Morrow tragically was killed, and in many ways even more tragically, two young children who were siblings, who his character was supposed to be carrying, saving these two young children, and they had a helicopter and a pyrotechnic went off and it caused the helicopter to crash on to Vic Morrow while he was carrying the two children, and all three of them died instantly, and that's just was an awful tragedy. There's a lot of debate about it. I'll maybe talk a little bit at the end of this video. This is going to be one of the longest 31 Horrors of Mike because I want to go through each of the stories, but I will talk about the controversy a little bit more at the end. The funny thing is, when I watched this story when I was a kid, I almost felt there was something. I'm not saying that there was something paranormal going on, but the tone of the film, this story is so dark that it felt as if there was something off. Also, and this is one of the saddest things about the film from an artistic perspective, the story is incomplete because they never got to film all of it. So they edit it with a very downbeat ending, and it was supposed to have a more upbeat ending to it. Anyway, so the original story is about Vic Morrow's character who goes to a local bar to meet up with a couple of his friends after work, and he is in a rage, he's angered, he's bitter because another man has been given a promotion that he was really thought that he deserved and really was holding out hope for. The problem is that Vic Morrow's character is an absolute racist bigot, and he sits there talking about this guy because he's Jewish, or the Jews own everything, all of these stupid conspiracy theories you get about Jewish people, and then he starts talking about blacks and Asians, and just he manages to cover and offend almost everybody, and eventually leaves the bar in a rage. But when he's outside, when he leaves the bar, he finds himself, and this is one of these things, it's not explained, it's the Twilight Zone, stuff like this happens. He finds himself in Nazi Germany. He leaves the bar, turns round, and the bar's gone, and he finds himself persecuted by Nazis who are chasing him, who believe that he's Jewish, and obviously it's a time in the concentration camps and the Holocaust. And then he starts zipping around through time, much like Quantum Leap, only not happy at all, where he becomes an African American being persecuted by the Ku Klux Klan, and also and this is probably more controversial if you're a member of the American audience at this time, was that there is the criticism of perhaps American interference in things like Vietnam and stuff like that, because he finds himself being shot at by American soldiers, and the character mentions that he fought in Korea, a different war, but he fought for America, and then he's found himself on the other side of this conflict. So he jumps around, and that's kind of the gist of it. And it's like, maybe it is a bit too on the nose for some people. He's being shown what it's like to be persecuted against. There's an interesting little piece of trivia. If you are a fan of John Landis, and I get why people don't like him because of what happened in this film, and I can understand that, but regardless of that, I think he's made some good films. There's a character in Animal House who you hear that after Animal House, this character was shot by his own men in Vietnam, and the American soldiers mention it. So in a really, really strange, weird way, Twilight Zone the movie is a sequel to Animal House. I know that's crazy, but I mean, it's obviously John Landis likes putting in little in jokes, like "See you next Wednesday" he puts in most of his films and things like that. So it is just that, but it's quite weird thinking about it that way. So overall, the opening story I think it's really effective, but knowing what happened in real life, what happened during the production, and it does end on a downbeat, whereas the original story was supposed to be the character. Well, it's not really ruining things if I tell you how the story was originally going to end. He would be redeemed. He would be redeemed, and he would see the errors of his ways. But that doesn't really happen here. So Vic Morrow's fantastic in this. He really is, and just the whole thing is an absolute tragedy. So anyway, that's the first story. The second story is I'm trying to think if I've got them in the right order. Yeah, I think I have. The second story is Kick the Can, which is by Spielberg. This is probably the one that is a little bit too, I mean, it's total Spielberg. It's about an old folks home, and a character played by Scatman Crothers, who you might know from The Shining. He comes to this old folks home and tells people that they should really think of themselves as young and not think of being old, and you should always try to have fun. And it's almost as if he has some sort of magical ability, and he turns everybody that's old in the old folks home young again for one night, and it's kind of about that. As much as it's I can understand why people don't like this one. It is total Spielberg. It's totally overly sentimental. I get a tear in my eye whenever I watch it, because it reminds me of, my gran was in a nursing home, and unfortunately it was nothing like this. This nursing home's quite nice. It was nothing like that, and so maybe the reason why the idea of people being old and wanting to be young affects me is because of those memories as a child. So that might be a personal thing. So it's difficult for me to judge that story separately. That being said, I can objectively look at it and say that it's certainly the story that works the least. But in Spielberg's defence, I think it was a last minute decision to do this story. There was another one that he was meant to be doing, and I think possibly because of the tragedy that happened in the film, he decided maybe that the story that he had originally chose to film wasn't really fitting. I think maybe he wanted to do something a little bit more positive. So it's very enjoyable. There are a few in jokes as well that I'm sure some of you will get with Douglas Fairbanks Jr. And I like it. Like I say, emotionally it affects me the most out of all the stories, but I do recognise that it's probably the least successful, and then it doesn't straddle the line between being emotional but not bashing you over the head with the sentimentality. I think it does probably cross that line a little bit. But Scatman as well, Crullers, not Scatman. Scatman was a different guy. Scatman Crullers is like fantastic, and he's one of these guys that I could probably have watched in any film. Anyway, that's the second story by Spielberg. I should mention, by the way, the prologue that I talked about at the beginning, that's directed by John Landis, and then John Landis did the last one, and then Steven Spielberg did this one. So the third story is based on a Twilight Zone episode, and it's about a teacher who is going through this small town, and she runs over a young boy, and she takes him to his house because she ran over him and broke his bike, and his family's there, and his family are like very strange. They don't really seem like his family. They're like overly nice to him. It's just very, very odd. The whole house is skewed. It's very impressionistic. It's like watching expressionist. It's very much like expressionistic. It's very much like watching German expressionism. Everything's at weird angles, and the corners are contorted. In some ways, the production design looks like Tim Burton could have had a hand in it. And we've got we've got people like Kevin McCarthy from Invasion of the Body Snatchers is in this. I think it's a good story. The main thing with it is that there is something wrong with the family and the little boy, and this teacher's come here and she'll soon find out why things are so skewed and weird there. It is a good story. Some of the special effects are really great, but it is wild. Joe Dante directed this one, and it is wild, but I think it's a lot of fun. It's bizarrely probably the one that I didn't enjoy the most as a kid, but watching it again as an adult, I do enjoy it. I think it's really effective, and like I say, there are physical effects in this section, the Twilight Zone, the movie, which really, really work. Creatures, animatronics and things like that, which are actually really well done, and it's very cartoony. This part of it, the film plays out with a cartoon aesthetic, but there's a reason for that, and you'll see why if you watch it. So yeah, still a good segment, well done. And the last segment in the film is based on probably the most famous, or one of the most famous Twilight Zone episodes, which was Terror at 20,000 Feet, which starred William Shatner. Again, Kirk, can't go wrong with that. About a man who is afraid of flying, he's terrified, but he starts warning people on this plane that there's something wrong, and he sees something on the wing, and there seems to be some sort of creature on the wing, and nobody believes him because they know that he's phobic, and he sees this thing on the wing sort of tearing the wing up out there as they're flying, and that's the story. In this version, John Lithgow plays the main character, and I have to say he's brilliant. He's absolutely fantastic. He really ups the anxiety levels, and it's a great performance. The whole story's fantastic. As somebody who suffers from aviophobia, I have to say that it's I totally understand where he's coming from. But there's a creature out on the plane, and the effects for the creature are really well done. And I actually, as a kid, I found that quite frightening, some of it. And then after this story, it brings in, kind of loops round to the start of the film. That's how his book ended. But the George Miller directs this part of the film, and it's really, really well done. It really is. Now, overall, I think it's an anthology film which really deserves much more attention than it gets, for good reasons. It deserves to be looked at because I think it's better than people give it credit for. I don't believe that that it captures the spirit of the Twilight Zone series, and that's one of the biggest criticisms you give to it. I think it's respectful, but the tone's just not quite right. But it's still a very good anthology film. You don't get many films where you've got 4 great directors all working together on different parts of it. And excuse me, struggling, still get this cold. So the whole controversy with it, if you don't know what happened after Vic Morrow died and the children died, the controversy was, because you might think that was just a horrible accident, but the controversy was that manslaughter charges were brought against John Landis and a few others that were involved in the production because the children shouldn't have been there. Because it broke employment laws, and they had deliberately broken those laws to shoot it at night. In fact, they even tried to hide the fact that the kids were on the cast because there were firefighters there in case anything went wrong with pyrotechnics, and they told the family of the 2 kids, don't let anyone know that they're actually actors here because if no one's supposed to know. So they did break the law. It was a terrible tragedy. And a lot of people just haven't forgiven the likes of John Landis. You know, he was the director. There's a lot of rumours that Steven Spielberg was there that night and he jumped in a car and left. Again, that's an accusation that I don't think we can ever really know exactly what happened. But it's just an absolute tragedy. The court case, they were all found not guilty, by the way, and John Landis I don't think ever recovered from it as a director. I think he went into a deep depression for a couple of years, so he when he did come back as a director, I think he certainly lost something. Coming to America is good. I enjoyed Coming to America, but I think if you watch John Landis's films after that, they don't seem to have the same quirky energy to them. But he certainly seems to have refound his energy, and I admire him as a filmmaker. And I did a review of a book that he wrote as well, Monsters and Movies, which was really good. But I can understand why people don't like it. A lot of people call him a murderer, and he's not a murderer. You know, if it was anything, it was manslaughter. But who was to blame? Was it the director? Was it the producer? Was it the pilot in the helicopter? Did he get too close when he shouldn't have? Was it the special effects? Was it the stunt crew? Should they have stepped in and said, no, this shouldn't happen, it's too dangerous? Because they have a veto, they can shut production down. There are a load, and they seem to all blame each other. So I think, to be honest, they probably all had a part in it, but certainly it was negligence more than anything else. So anyway, I'm sorry, this is the longest 31 Horrors of Mike because it's an anthology film and it's one that means a lot to me, and I wanted to talk a lot about the different segments. Definitely go and check it out. I think the one positive thing that came from the film was that they tightened up regulations in terms of what filmmakers could and couldn't do, because filmmakers do tend to push the envelope a little bit with flouting rules to try and get the shot that they want, and that all got sorted out so that hopefully that wouldn't happen again. And people were very, very careful with using helicopter photography and things like that from then on. And also it inspired the relaunching of Twilight Zone as a television series again. So that's how we got the 1980s version of Twilight Zone. So go and check that out. I think it's worth watching. Is it horror? I think there are horror elements, and that's why I put it in this list. Certainly the beginning, the opening prologue, is a horror story. The last story, I think, is a horror story. Kick the Can obviously isn't horror, but it's fantasy, and it's reminiscent almost of something that Ray Bradbury would write, in my opinion. And then but the story with the child and the teacher, that's got horror elements, certainly in it as well. So go check that out. I'll be back very shortly because I've got another one to do because it was a day behind. So I'm going to come right back with another horror review. It will be much more concise this time. Alright, bye for now.